Hello. Once again, I apologize for the belatedness of this. I am just now getting caught up. But this is the last of our three History of Antarctica lectures. And this doesn't quite cover as much ground as Lecture 12 did, which was the lecture on the pre-heroic age history. But we are still going to go pretty quickly, breezing by the world wars to the International Geophysical Year and the signing of the Antarctic Treaty. And part of this relates to the fact that the world wars limited the resources and interest in Antarctic exploration for unsurprising reasons. But we will see that there were some interesting geopolitical incidents related to the world wars that would provide motivation for some countries to establish a system for governing Antarctica. And we'll talk about what that system is, the Antarctic Treaty System. The second half of the lecture will be an overview of what conservation in Antarctica, as well as what economic activities do occur today, and some more recent geopolitical conflicts that underscore the need for the Antarctic Treaty. And we have not talked about climate change yet. That will be next week's topic, much more heavily. Just a quick reminder that the Antarctic Exploration Lab is due February 26th at 11:59 p.m., as is lecture quiz number 2. Looking forward, reading assignment number 2 is due at the end of Dead Week. So we have 3 remaining weeks, although there's 1 week after this lecture comes out, then Dead Week, then Finals Week. I am figuring out precisely how I will handle Dead Week, but it will be dedicated to review, and there will not be new material. So lectures 15 and 16 on climate change, which will come out during week 9, will be the last new lectures of material. And I will be devoting class time and review sessions during Dead Week to review, and I will also be putting out the study guide for the final before then. So here's a summary of what we're covering today. This is an orca sculpture at McMurdo, by the way. I just thought it made a nice piece for this. But the heroic age ends with World War I, aka the Great War, basically. And then there's relatively little in terms of Antarctic exploration until after World War II. Not nothing, but the pace slows quite a bit just because broadly the world is concerned with other matters, shall we say. But countries did begin to lay claims to Antarctica. Many of these countries had sent explorers there during the heroic age, and there were a number of military operations and aborted attempts to start bases, some more serious than others. And this underscored the need for a conversation about what to do with Antarctica and for a system for dealing with Antarctica. And we'll talk about a period of renewed focus in scientific research in Antarctica during a thaw in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union that led to the International Geophysical Year, which was a period of concentrated research, as well ultimately as the drafting and signing of the Antarctic Treaty. And Lecture 14b gives a short summary of conservation, economic activity, and recent geopolitical conflicts. After the heroic age, much more of Antarctica had been mapped, and all of the coastline was reasonably well known by that point. And during the heroic age, many of the explorers would, at some point during their trip, plant a flag, and they would claim the newly explored lands for their governing empire. This was, of course, going to prove very difficult to enforce, and it also wasn't really clear what legal basis one had to claim any territory, which is always honestly, always a bit of an open question when this stuff happens. I'll just put this over here. And the British had begun by claiming a number of the subantarctic islands. They established what's known as the Falkland Islands Dependency in 1908, which still exists. The Falkland Islands are not quite subantarctic. They actually still, to this day, support a population of a few thousand British citizens. They've never had an indigenous population, though. They're quite a ways from the South American mainland. And I mentioned earlier that the indigenous people of the southern South America didn't build ships that could handle the current. So the Falkland Islands were uninhabited for a very long time. They're now a British dependency, and the British also claimed South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, which are now a separate territory. This is their flag, which has a penguin and a seal and a deer on it for whatever reason, which I find kind of amusing. The deer are kind of amusing because the reindeer were introduced and were eradicated later, which I find kind of hilarious. But anyway, the South Shetlands and the South Orkneys were also claimed by the British. And the UK did this because they wanted to formalize the revenue gaining from sealing and whaling. They wanted to enforce license fees for those operations. But this was kind of futile because A, nobody enforced it. B, by the early 20th century, both industries were in decline. The seal population had plummeted from overhunting, as had the whale population, and also the need for whale oil had just begun to disappear because whale oil was used to light lamps and electricity had been invented and was becoming in much more widespread use by this time. And that has let whale populations recover in peace somewhat, a few exceptions aside, but their populations have still not completely rebounded because whales are so slow to reproduce. And as far as the Antarctic continent itself, various governments began to claim portions of Antarctica in the hopes of securing mining rights or the ability to build military bases down the line, both of which are now explicitly banned by the Antarctic Treaty, in fact. The coast was mapped much more extensively than the interior, so these claims often took the form of sectors of longitude. So they would define it by one line of longitude and by another line, and you'd get this kind of cone-shaped sector coming from the South Pole. And again, notice the cone shape. Remember from geography that lines of longitude converge at the poles. So Britain had previously claimed a small portion of the peninsula, but in 1917, they revised their claim to extend so that it took 20 degrees west to 80 degrees west, which you can see on here. And this occupied the whole area around the peninsula. New Zealand decided to formally claim the Ross Dependency, which is the area around Ross Island, the Ross Sea, and McMurdo Base, actually. And France went on to claim Adélie Land in 1924, the small sliver. Australia then decided to claim everything between New Zealand's claim and this would be 45 degrees west, but France had already claimed a sliver, so Australia had to modify it so that they excluded France's claim. And then Norway also made a claim. Remember that Norway was where Roald Amundsen and a bunch of other explorers were from, and they strangely didn't really specify their claim as being a sector. So the area that's between these longitudes but closer to the pole is unclaimed and very poorly defined. They claimed what's known as Queen Maud Land, and you'll notice that a lot of these claims overlap, which I'll talk about on the next slide. It was kind of a messy affair. There is still a small sliver of Antarctica, Marie Byrd land, that is unclaimed. I am not completely clear why it's been unclaimed. Nowadays, the whole idea of Antarctic claims is pretty moot because of the treaty. But in the meantime, by 1939, most of Antarctica was claimed, except for Marie Byrd land and a couple of other slivers. The US and the USSR did something kind of laughable, and they both claimed the entire continent, which nobody took seriously whatsoever. Meanwhile, some South American countries were fearing that they could lose access to resources or fishing rights, and so Chile made a claim in 1940. They claimed 53 to 90 degrees west, and that actually overlaps with the UK claim. Argentina, not to be outdone, claimed a sliver a few years later that overlaps with both Chile and the UK. And this was all going on during the Second World War. Notice this renewed push for claims. Antarctica was quite removed from the main fronts of fighting in the Pacific Ocean and Europe, but many of the parties involved in the Second World War had claims in Antarctica, and there were still a number of small-scale military operations and attempts at building bases during this time as kind of a flexing of geopolitical power. The first United States base was known as Little America. It was constructed by Richard Byrd, who was an adventurer who claimed to have been the first person to fly a plane to the North Pole. That claim has been heavily disputed, but he is known to have made the first flight to the South Pole. And he is the first person to have brought aviation to Antarctica, even though there had been some attempts at using planes before. On his first trip, he took 2 ships as well as 3 airplanes and built a base camp on the Ross Ice Shelf, on the extension of the glacier itself over the Ross Sea. He built it near the Bay of Whales on the eastern side of the Ross Sea where Amundsen had started his journey to the South Pole. And they spent the first summer undertaking geologic surveys, taking photographs, and Byrd flew to the South Pole in November 1929 during a second summer. And he was forced to actually throw supplies out of his plane and throw fuel out to get enough lift to get over the polar plateau, to get up the ice sheet, which would be unthinkable now because you can't just dump things in Antarctica. That is extremely illegal, and I cringe even thinking about it. But anyhow, he would actually return to Antarctica a second time and operate a weather station for 5 months by himself. He would have to be rescued, actually, because he ran out of supplies. And Little America doesn't exist anymore. The base collapsed since it was built on an ice shelf, and the government of the US actually made a number of nearby camps over the course of the following years, but just with the need of them having to be rebuilt and the ice shelf not being ideal for building a permanent camp, the United States began to look for possible sites for a more stable land-based location for a future base. Meanwhile, the first permanent bases in Antarctica were constructed by the United Kingdom in the 1940s, and the Second World War was fully underway by this point. The UK, like the US, was at war with Japan as well as Germany. Japan had sent one expedition to Antarctica and made a half-serious claim. And this was back when Japan was still an empire, a more formal empire. They had sent one expedition, made a half-serious claim, and Germany had also launched several expeditions. But in the 1930s, by which point the Nazi Party was in control, they had made another expedition to Antarctica, actually, and claimed a portion of Antarctica as New Swabia. And they didn't really enforce this very well, but it made the Allies nervous. And so the British sent a small force to the peninsula, and they decided to send more troops to the Falkland Islands in the process. And they went further south and just removed a couple of Argentine flags that had been used as claims for some of the subantarctic islands. Argentina had claimed Deception Island, which you remember was the island with the bay used by whalers. And Argentina was nominally neutral, but had close ties with the Axis powers. And the UK was fearing that Argentina would collaborate with Germany and Japan to seize their subantarctic territories. The Argentinian government wasn't exactly thrilled about this, and it didn't help with the relations between Argentina and the UK. Argentina and the UK would go to war in the 1980s over the Falkland Islands, which we'll talk about during the second half of this lecture, actually. And we don't really touch on World War II all that much in this class, but needless to say, it was devastating. It was devastating in terms of loss of life and destruction, and also the Holocaust happened as a result of the Holocaust happened. So we don't really touch that much on World War II because Antarctica was to some extent removed from the fighting. There were a couple of little skirmishes, but I bring this up because in many ways the US was also removed from the fighting, even though it was a direct participant. Not very much fighting actually occurred on US soil. And the US, which had been a very isolationist country before World War II, had emerged as a global superpower, for better or worse. It had the military, it had the money and military resources to influence other countries, and was seen as being, and it and the Soviet Union became the two countries that had the most geopolitical influence in the aftermath of World War II. So the United States exited the war rather strengthened in terms of its world power, and it was in a strong position to establish more of an influence in Antarctica. And so in 1946, the US Navy operated an expedition with the name Operation Highjump, and it was nominally and publicly chartered for exploration and for aerial mapping. And it did indeed accomplish that purpose, actually. Out of the expedition came 70,000 aerial photos of the coast and the dry valleys, which provided one of the first systematic data sets that covered a large amount of the continent. And I actually used some of those photos when I was examining areas that I was going to be doing field research in before I went on my field research. Those photos can be made accessible to those people who are doing Antarctic research. And that's something we'll talk about further, that Antarctic research it's made to be collaborative. It must be collaborative, and the research must be open to, the findings must be made available to others. But the truth is that this was a front for a military operation. It was a truthfully, this was a front to find it. They were looking for a place to build a military base. Most experts think that it was done also with the intention of training soldiers, and that the base being there was going to serve as a training ground for soldiers. And this was because the US was deathly afraid of having to actually go to war with the Soviet Union. A possible war with the Soviet Union was going to involve possible Arctic warfare, because Siberia touches the Arctic, as well as fighting in the cold tundra of Siberia, or even just fighting in Russia in the winter in general. If you've taken a history class, you know that if you've taken a European history class and remember that Napoleon was basically screwed over by trying to invade Russia and not knowing what he was doing when he invaded Russia, and that's really what crippled his army. And Hitler also tried to invade Russia, and that was a terrible idea, from his perspective, that is. But other countries have had not very good luck invading Russia, because Russia is cold and muddy, and typically the people defending Russia have had more experience dealing with those conditions than the people trying to invade Russia. So the United States didn't want to have to fight on the Soviet turf at all. And experts think that Operation Highjump was designed to build a base where they were scouting out for a base where US soldiers could train to fight in the Arctic and in Russia. And no full-scale war between the United States and the Soviet Union, either in the Arctic, Antarctica, or elsewhere, broke out, but tensions remained high. And of course, we had proxy wars like the war in Korea, the war in Vietnam, and also the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And this all went on throughout the Cold War. Something else to mention is that both sides had nuclear weapons. And the memory of what had happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities to end the war in the Pacific, the pictures of the people who had been burned by that, the horror of the scale of destruction was still at the front of people's heads. And the United States and the Soviet Union both had nuclear weapons, but there was understandable global trepidation about those being used, and also concerns about those being tested. And that was one concern that would feed into the formation of the Antarctic Treaty later. And on this next slide, I have a couple of pictures from Operation Highjump. And you can see that they were using wooden structures that don't exist anymore. It's not where McMurdo Base is now. And as we'll find out, the military has still had a presence in Antarctica in the modern age, just not building their own bases, serving as support for scientists. And speaking of science, that brings us to the International Geophysical Year. And that is a big turning point in Arctic history in 1957. And why was 1957 through 1958 the International Geophysical Year? Kind of because they said so, they being the scientific community. And the scientific, it's kind of like the Pope invoking a Jubilee year, in a sense. The scientific community came to this consensus that this was going to be a year of concentrated Antarctic research, and it was not the first time something like this had been done. In 1882 and 1932, the years had both been declared as International Polar Years. But 1957 wasn't chosen completely arbitrarily. For one thing, in the 1950s, there was something of a thaw or a mild normalizing of relations between the US and the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, the ruler during World War II, who had taken a very hard line against the US afterwards, died and was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, who was seen as a little bit easier to work with, and at least for a brief window, the prospect of a less negative, if not completely friendly, relationship between the countries seemed possible. Meanwhile, the question of what to do with Antarctica was still lingering, and in the wake of world wars, as well as the largely unregulated visits to Antarctica that had happened, there was a consensus that some protocol needed to be established. And so American and British scientists first proposed that a targeted period of research be declared, actually in some ways to follow up on the discoveries found during the heroic age, because there had been relatively little specific science fact-finding in the meantime. And there was something of a radical notion in contrast from the heroic age, and the suggestion was that the research be carried out as an international collaboration rather than as the effort of one country. And the idea was that this might reduce possible acrimoniousness and tensions about Antarctica. And 1957 also, by chance, was a year in which solar radiation would be at its maximum output, which would both make Antarctica slightly warmer and brighter, and also provide an opportunity for astronomy research. It was referred to as the geophysical year because of the focus on geology and astronomy and physics research, but lots of projects were done, and they were the projects were all Antarctica related. So in total, it ended up actually turning into an 18-month period rather than just a year. And ultimately, 67 different scientific organizations from around the world contributed. They contributed funding or participated in some way. And the projects all had an Antarctic focus. Some of them, aside from geology or physics, related to climate research or to biology. And in many ways, the IGY is when the procedure for what's done with it, it's kind of when modern Antarctica came into being. It's when many of the permanent bases were built. It's when the precedent for Antarctica being used almost solely for research purposes came into existence, and when the protocol of research being collaborative and open to international scrutiny came into play. So really, the IGY is when modern Antarctica begins, and it was when the first iteration of Amundsen Scott Base was built. This structure has been since completely torn down and replaced by a better structure. But it was kind of a big deal because the South Pole had been such a dangerous zone for so long, but now less than a century later, it was possible to build human habitation there, which is quite remarkable. And it became clear that scientific collaboration was important. The International Council of Scientific Unions, which is a collective assembly of the various scientific organizations like the NSF or the French or Japanese or Chinese or British equivalent, they began drafting documents to formalize how Antarctica was going to be handled from a political standpoint, as well as the protocol for conducting research. And that's how the treaty came about. So the Antarctic Treaty was signed the year after the geophysical year ended in 1959, and it went into force in 1961. It expires in 2048, and its purpose was to establish that Antarctica would not be a site of international conflict. In addition to codifying protocol for science, it also served as a de-escalation. As much as they didn't really get along, neither the US nor the USSR really wanted there to be any reason to end up at war together in Antarctica or the Southern Ocean. And the treaty kind of established Antarctica as a bit of a neutral zone, which is how there still ended up being some ongoing collaboration between the Soviet Union and the US, even though they remained officially extremely unfriendly for the next better part of a half century. The treaty is quite long, but here are a couple of its key points. It encourages that science occur. It really stipulates that Antarctica should be used for science and not much else. The science should be safe, meaning that they don't want shipwrecks, they don't want lots of dead bodies in Antarctica, they don't want people engaging in risky behavior, and activities need to be approved before they're allowed to happen. And the activities have to be low impact, meaning that say if you're going to build an observatory, that has to undergo review. You can't just build an observatory willy-nilly without consulting whether there might be a penguin breeding ground there, or whether clearing ice is going to cause problems, or using explosives might have unseen effects. And importantly, it stipulates that countries conducting research are required to share their results. And this means that the NSF can't make a secret of my geochemical findings, even if it wanted to. Not that it would want to, because there's nothing particularly sensitive about the lampreyferes that I was studying, but the point stands. And the idea is that Antarctica is for all countries, not just any one country, and that scientists who are studying there are doing studies for science as a whole and for humanity as a whole, not just for the glory or advancement of their particular nation. And obviously, that doesn't always completely pan out in practice, but it's codified as a standard for what Antarctic research should aspire to be. And it explicitly bans testing or use of nuclear weapons or dumping of radioactive waste, which desperately needed to be put in writing before any countries even considered doing such a thing. Anybody who's studied local Nevada, like just 20th century Nevada history, and will have heard the term Yucca Mountain. The US, we don't really know what to do with our nuclear waste still, which is one big problem with nuclear power. But you cannot put it in Antarctica, which is good, because we don't need penguin populations mutating and dying from that. And military activities were also banned unless they were done strictly in support of science. And so you can't build military bases, you can't conduct training operations, you can't drop bombs, you can't do anything unless you are explicitly there, like flying planes for the scientists or moving their gear. The military cannot be there for itself. And it also importantly nullified all of the territorial claims that I talked about at the start of this lecture. And the treaty states that signatories do not recognize each other's claims and they don't try to enforce their own. This makes it so that the location of a country's base doesn't have anything to do with any pre-Antarctic treaty claims. So the US doesn't have a claim now. It facetiously claimed the whole continent at one point, but the US has several bases, and McMurdo, the largest base, is actually in the New Zealand Antarctic claim, but it's a completely moot point because of the treaty. And when I went there, I didn't have to sign any particular different papers being like, you are entering New Zealand Antarctica now. It would have been kind of ridiculous because I was in New Zealand before going to Antarctica, period. And finally, it stipulates that other nations can monitor each other's activities, that kind of in the spirit of international collaboration, that countries can't really just like build a base and be like, oh, you can't look at this, like you can't find out what we're doing, that's classified. So there's a standard practice now of countries performing joint inspections of other countries, like I believe other countries' bases. I believe this joint Soviet-U.S. inspection, or excuse me, this is post-Soviet, this joint Russian Federation and United States inspection was done. I think it was done of a British base, actually. But the idea is that no country is really hiding what they're doing in Antarctica. And in part, this was in response to stuff like Operation Highjump, when the US was not very transparent about the fact that it was trying to build a base for training soldiers in Antarctica. And like any document, like the US Constitution or any country's constitution or any state's constitution or any charter, the Antarctic Treaty has needed amendments as new practical needs have become clear. And the set of the treaty as well as the addenda are known as the Antarctic Treaty System. In 1964, an amendment called the Agreed Measures for the Conservation of Antarctic Flora and Fauna was drawn up, and this was to address conservation of Antarctic biodiversity. The other amendments have also largely referred to wildlife because many of the ongoing issues, as we'll find out, have related to whaling and fishing. So in 1972, in response, as a way to codify seal protections, the Convention of the Conservation of Antarctic Seals was commissioned to address the recovery of the seal populations, and it completely banned killing Ross seals as well as Antarctic fur seals, and the Antarctic fur seal had been the main target because they were mostly hunting for furs. So this effectively put an end to sealing in the Antarctic, which needed to happen given just the sheer degree of overhunting in the 19th century. And in 1980, meanwhile, concerns about the loss of krill as well as overfishing led to the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which limited the amount of fishing allowed near Antarctica and also set new quotas for different Antarctic marine species, with the possibilities that they would be lowered if the krill population continued to drop, and that continued to put Antarctic food webs in peril. And krill populations have continued to decline, to some extent because of the loss of sea ice, which we'll talk about next week more. And this has caused fish to decline with them, and there is a concern that there has not been a big enough adjustment to the quota in recent years. It's questionable how much commercial fishing should even be allowed there at all. One of the biggest changes occurred in 1998, and this codified that no new activities could be conducted in Antarctica until a full environmental review was done. And this has in practice made scientific research a bit more restrictive out of concern for not damaging the environment with ambitious or untested experiments, and also trying to enforce this idea of you need to prove to us that you need to do this in Antarctica. Could you do this in the United States? Could you do this somewhere else? If so, don't do it in Antarctica, because we really don't want to be using Antarctica more than it needs to be used. And so today, the Antarctic Treaty System is what governs Antarctica by binding law. It's signed by 53 nations out of 200 or so, and that's pretty much all the countries that have bases, as well as a number of countries that don't have bases but do research on other people's bases. And a few countries have joined in the meantime. In 2015, Iceland, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia joined. And Kazakhstan actually has a history of research with Antarctica because it was part of the Soviet Union for a long time, but it's now an independent country, and it is now a separate signatory to the treaty. So I mentioned that military activities were banned, but that they could still be, an exception was made if the military was present and explicitly supporting science. And much of this relates to the fact that when the US first began building bases, we very heavily relied on the Navy. We relied on Navy Seabees because they had the know-how to build structures from scratch in remote, inhospitable places with nothing to start from. Because again, there is nothing in Antarctica. There aren't trees. You have to bring in everything, plan it very thoroughly. You're working with not much margin for error when constructing. And yeah, so you want people who know what they're doing. And Operation Deep Freeze was launched in 1955 in preparation for the International Geophysical Year. Yes, it was quite heavily planned. So it was with the purpose of building bases, flying people to Antarctica, and providing general support and tacticians. Interestingly enough, Richard Byrd, who had been the Little America guy, actually was appointed as the head officer because of his experience. And Operation Deep Freeze initially was only to be a 2-year operation to refer to the preparatory building of the South Pole Station. But they immediately declared Operation Deep Freeze 2, since it was decided that since they had the know-how to run logistics, it was easiest to just have them keep doing it, at least through the International Geophysical Year. When the IGY ended, they kind of just kept it going because the relationship had worked and they didn't really want to mess things up too much. Long term, the Navy wasn't super happy about this, I believe, and it was kind of a bit of a contentious issue. And the Navy sort of was looking to break up the responsibility a bit going forward. So eventually, this continued until 1998, and way, 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 way long after Operation Deep Freeze was supposed to end. Nowadays, Operation Deep Freeze is used in collective to refer to the period in which the Navy was the sole logistics manager to Antarctica for the United States. And functionally for a lot of other countries too, because a lot of scientists from other countries fly from Christchurch through McMurdo Base using the US. In 1998, the Navy officially transferred operations to a joint system in which the US Air Force and the Air National Guard continue to fly planes to Antarctica. So I was flown to Antarctica on a military plane by the Air Force. And then operations are run by the NSF and the US Antarctic Program in collaboration with private contractors. So Lockheed Martin is now the private contractor used by the US Antarctic Program. Meanwhile, there was one of the other early successes of the IGY outside of building bases was crossing the continent on a vehicle. This was years after Shackleton and Scott had tried and failed to use cars. The project was a collaboration between several countries, and it was named the Commonwealth Transantarctic Expedition because most of the countries aside from the US are part of the British Commonwealth. The British Commonwealth is basically the countries that still technically recognize Queen Elizabeth as their queen and have ties to the UK, even though they're also self-governing. The US is not part of this. We officially departed the UK via an armed revolution in 1776, but the US was also part of this expedition. And Sir Edmund Hillary, who is most famous for climbing Mount Everest, actually donated a tractor as one of the vehicles to be modified and tested out for a possible crossing. So he didn't come to Antarctica himself, but he was quite the polar science enthusiast and wanted to be part of the project. And the voyage was a success, but it was a very hard trip, and another crossing by vehicle would not happen again until 1981. The South Pole would be almost exclusively accessed by air until very recently. The new South Pole base was completed in 2007, and part of the project involved actually building a road from the coast to South Pole base so that more consistent road traffic could be accommodated. So you can drive from the coast to the South Pole now, albeit very, very slowly. I would want to make sure that I had plenty of music for that. I mean, yes, Antarctic scenery, but like the music helps I would want music to go along with the Antarctic scenery. If my music player went out, I would be depressed during that long drive. Now we're almost at the end of the first half of the lecture, and we'll be transitioning from Antarctic exploration to modern Antarctica, just kind of talking about that. But I wanted to include something that is important to me and just I feel like is important in general, and it's the role of women in Antarctic exploration. Because I've been saying Shackleton's men, etc., and that's normally terminology I avoid using, but I haven't been trying as hard to stop it this time because, as far as we all know, it was all men for a long time. Women were excluded from. I mean, there's that myth that it's bad luck to have a woman on board a ship, wherever that came from. But for years, just in general, there were institutional barriers for women being engaged in science, exploration, or being anything besides a man's wife. As a lesbian, I'm side-eyeing that. But apparently 3 women actually applied to join Shackleton's 1914 expedition, and he never wrote them back. But ship's crews were virtually all male during the heroic age. But by the 1930s, there were more recreational trips to the coast happening, and the first woman known to see Antarctica was Ingrid Christensen, as well as her companion Mathilde Weger, and Miss Christensen was traveling with her husband. And so this was a pretty common occurrence. A lot of the first women to see Antarctica were traveling with their husbands. I believe Miss Christensen was actually the first woman to land on the continent as well. This has changed a bit in the 20th and 21st centuries, as some institutional barriers have at least been officially removed. And the first woman to reach both poles was actually an American woman named Anne Bancroft in 1993, and she led the first all-female expedition to the South Pole. A year later, a Norwegian woman named Liv Arnesen became the first woman to ski alone to the South Pole. And in 2001, those two collaborated. Bancroft and Arnesen became the first women to ski across Antarctica. And I remember this actually. I was in first grade then, and my class would get the Time for Kids magazine that Time put out as for news for kids. And I came across their story. They were on the front page of one of them. And so I read about how these two women were becoming the first to trek across Antarctica. And then a couple months later, there was a little blurb in one of the other editions that was like, phew, they made it. So I kind of got to follow, in a way, I got to follow this expedition before I was really on the internet or even knew much about Antarctica or had an idea that I might go someday. Um, I personally, one of the most impressive figures to me is Barbara Hillary. Um, and she was 75 when she became the first Black woman to reach the North Pole in 2007, years and years after Matthew Henson became the first person and the first Black man to reach the North Pole. But she didn't stop there. She actually reached the South Pole at age 79, several years later, and she became the first known Black woman to reach both poles. And I am just amazed that someone approaching 80 did that trek to the South Pole. She was in amazingly good shape. She's no longer with us, sadly. But she achieved a lot during her lifetime. And I'm especially given the overall whiteness and lack of Black people and Black women in polar exploration, I think her achievement is really amazing. And there have really still been relatively few women and few women of color who have explored Antarctica, but the work that those who have done has been pretty amazing. And more are going now. All right, so we'll be talking about the modern history of Antarctica in the second half of this lecture, so stay tuned for that.